Hey, hey. The morning began like any other, sunlight slipping through the curtains and filling the bedroom with a soft glow. I woke early, as usual, careful not to disturb Natalie, my wife. She lay there, peaceful in her sleep, her chest rising and falling steadily. I paused for a moment, simply watching her, captivated by the calm that always seemed to surround her when she slept. Our marriage had its fair share of highs and lows, joyful times woven in with arguments and periods of silence. Still, never did I think that this day, seemingly ordinary, would be the day that changed everything. I slipped down the hallway, making sure the floorboards didn't give me away. The house was cloaked in that quiet stillness only found in the early morning. In the kitchen, I set about my usual routine, brewing coffee. The familiar gurgle of the machine and the aroma of fresh beans helped ground me, signaling the start of another day. Preparing breakfast had become something of a calming ritual, a way to ease into the chaos that often followed. Little did I know, the real chaos hadn't even begun. As I set the table with 2 mugs of coffee and a simple spread, toast, eggs, fruit, I heard Natalie's soft footsteps. She walked into the kitchen sluggishly, her usual energy replaced by a tiredness that clung to her like a shadow. She gave me a small, tired smile, one that never quite reached her eyes, and slid into her usual spot at the table. Her presence felt distant, like something heavy weighed between us. "Morning, honey," I said, trying to keep my tone light and cheerful. "Morning," she replied, but there was no warmth in her voice, only a flatness that made me pause. She picked up her fork and pushed her food around the plate, eyes glued to the glow of her phone screen. The spark I once saw in her seemed dim, almost snuffed out. We'd been married for nearly 20 years, built on shared moments, love, and respect. Like any long relationship, we had slipped into routines that sometimes felt more like comfortable silences than anything else. But today, something was different. I could feel it in the air, a gnawing unease that settled deep in my gut. Natalie barely touched her food, poking at it absent-mindedly. A feeling of dread crept into my stomach as I watched her, trying to make sense of her mood. But her expression was unreadable, her focus entirely on her phone. I needed to break through the silence, find out what was going on. "Natalie," I said softly, trying not to sound too concerned. "Everything okay?" Her eyes flicked up to meet mine, sharp and intense, sending a chill down my spine. There was something in her gaze I didn't recognize, something dark. "Yeah, I'm fine," she said, but her voice lacked reassurance. There was a certain finality in her tone, almost as if daring me to ask again. I shrugged it off, trying to convince myself it was just one of those days. We all have them, don't we? Days where the weight of everything feels a little heavier than usual. We finished breakfast in silence. The unease that had settled over me earlier clung on, even as I prepared to leave for work. I gave her one last glance as I headed out the door. She was still at the table, hunched over her phone, her face illuminated by the screen. That gnawing feeling refused to leave me as I stepped outside. It followed me, a shadow hanging over what should have been just another regular day. Work was a drag. Every hour seemed to crawl by painfully slow. Meetings blurred together, emails went unanswered, and my focus was shot. That creeping anxiety stayed with me all day, tightening its grip. Something was wrong. I could feel it, though I didn't know why. My skin prickled with a vague sense of dread that only worsened as the hours ticked by. By the time I clocked out and drove home, the exhaustion ran deep. My hands gripped the steering wheel tightly as I navigated the familiar roads, but when I pulled into the driveway, everything felt different. The house looked the same, quiet, peaceful, but as soon as I walked inside, the air was thick with tension. The silence was deafening. No sign of Natalie. "Natalie?" I called, my voice echoing in the stillness. The emptiness of the room swallowed my words whole. No response. I wandered through the house, calling for her, my heart rate picking up with every unanswered call. The kitchen was empty, and the living room dark. Panic began to bubble up. It wasn't like her to just vanish without saying something. My mind raced as I searched each room, desperation in my voice. At last, I found her standing in the living room, facing the window, staring out into the darkness. Her back was rigid, her hands clenched tightly by her sides. Even without seeing her face, I could tell something was terribly wrong. "Natalie, what's going on?" I asked, stepping closer, concern thick in my voice. She didn't answer right away. For what felt like an eternity, she remained motionless, her gaze fixed on something invisible outside. When she finally turned to face me, the look in her eyes froze me in place. Whatever I had feared, this was worse. This wasn't the Natalie I had loved for years, the caring, affectionate woman I had married. The person standing in front of me now felt distant, cold, almost like a stranger. "We need to talk," she said. Her voice was emotionless, like she was making small talk, not deciding the fate of our marriage. My heart pounded hard in my chest, each beat thundering in my ears. I stepped closer, a sick feeling twisting in my gut. "What is it? What's going on?" She inhaled deeply, her expression hardening. It was as if she was preparing herself for what was about to come. When she spoke, her voice was eerily calm, completely void of any emotion, as though she had practiced these words over and over. "I'm seeing someone else." The shock hit me like a punch to the stomach. I staggered backward, my mind reeling. The room seemed to tilt as I struggled to grasp what she had just said. "What? How long?" "A few months," she answered without a hint of remorse. "His name's Adam. He's coming over tonight and we're spending the night together, in our bedroom. You'll make us dinner and serve him like a proper host. Got that?" My stomach churned. It felt like my entire world was collapsing right in front of me, everything I thought I knew shattering in an instant. The ground beneath me felt like it was slipping away, but I just stood there, stunned, trying to process it. "You're serious?" My voice cracked. "Yes," she said coldly, her eyes locking onto mine with a chilling indifference. It was hard to believe what I was hearing. The woman standing there was not the Natalie I had married. This was someone else, someone cold, heartless. Anger started bubbling up inside me, hot and fierce, threatening to swallow the despair that had nearly taken over. "If he even steps foot in this house, I'll break his jaw," I snarled, my voice trembling with fury. "And you'll deal with the consequences." But before I could say more, the front door creaked open. A shadow filled the entryway, and I turned to see him, Adam. He was bigger than I'd imagined, his broad shoulders practically filling the doorway. In his hand, he casually held a gun, a Magnum, gleaming coldly in the dim light. Seeing that gun made my blood run cold. This wasn't just an affair. This was an invasion, a hostile takeover, and I was about to lose everything, my life, my home. I stood there, paralyzed, as I watched the man who had stepped into my world, uninvited. Adam was huge, towering over me with a muscular build that made me feel insignificant in his presence. The gun in his hand was pointed downward, almost like it was just part of his casual stance, but its threat was unmistakable. It gleamed ominously in the shadows, a stark reminder of the danger I was in. I could barely register what was happening. This was my home, my sanctuary, and yet I was powerless, watching as this intruder took control. I looked to Natalie, hoping for some trace of the woman I loved. But what I saw chilled me to the core. She moved toward him with an air of submission, her whole demeanor changing. She looked adoring, as if she had become someone else entirely. She kissed him, her lips meeting his with a familiarity that made my stomach turn. My heart shattered into 1,000 pieces. The betrayal was so profound, it felt like a physical wound. "Did you tell him, babe?" Adam's voice was deep, almost growling, as he wrapped his arm possessively around her waist, pulling her close. Natalie nodded, a cruel smile twisting her lips. She looked at me with a mix of pity and disdain. "Yeah, I told him," she said, her voice laced with venom. "He's gonna make us dinner and play the good little host." Her words sliced through me. This wasn't just cheating. This was something much worse, a complete betrayal of everything we had shared. I wanted to fight back, to throw them both out of the house, to reclaim the life I was losing right before my eyes. But that gun, that cold, gleaming threat, kept me frozen in place, the fear of what might happen if I resisted holding me back. Adam laughed, his eyes glinting with smug amusement as he gestured toward the kitchen with the barrel of the gun. "Get in there, loser," he said. "Make us dinner." My hands trembled as I walked past them, each step heavier than the last, like I was walking deeper into a nightmare. Behind me, I could hear them laughing, the sound cold and cruel. It echoed in my head, twisting the knife deeper into my chest with every second. I was trapped, helpless. The kitchen felt unfamiliar now, like a place I didn't recognize anymore. The counters, the stove, the table where we had shared so many meals, all of it felt tainted, wrong. I moved through the motions of preparing dinner, my mind racing, trying to figure out how I had ended up in this nightmare. Each slice of the knife, each clang of a pan, was a painful reminder of my helplessness. My home had turned into a prison, and I was nothing but a servant. The smell of the food made me nauseous. I was cooking for the man who had stolen everything from me. In the other room, I could hear them talking and laughing, their voices low and intimate, like they were enjoying this twisted charade. Each laugh felt like a slap in the face, but I forced myself to keep going, to focus on what I was doing. I had no other choice. Finally, the meal was ready, and I carried the plates to the dining room. My heart was pounding in my chest, each step a struggle as I approached them. The weight of the plates in my hands seemed like nothing compared to the weight of humiliation and despair pressing down on me. Natalie and Adam were already seated, hands intertwined, waiting for me. They both looked up with amusement, their eyes gleaming with cruel satisfaction. "Well, isn't this just perfect?" Natalie sneered as I set the plates in front of them. Her voice was dripping with disdain. Adam chuckled, taking a sip of the wine I had poured for them. His grin was smug, making my skin crawl. "Better get used to this," he said, his voice casual, like this was just the beginning. "Things are going to be different around here." The anger inside me burned, but I bit my tongue. The gun, the situation, it left me with no other option. I swallowed my pride and stood there, helpless, as they began to eat the meal I had prepared. Every sound, their chewing, their casual conversation, was a reminder of how powerless I had become in my own home. That night was the longest, most degrading of my life, a slow descent into a nightmare I couldn't escape. Every passing minute chipped away at the man I once was, reducing me to a shell, trapped and powerless under their control. I felt the weight of the night pressing down on me, suffocating any last shred of hope. As they finished their meal and indulged in their twisted game, I stood by, watching my own downfall unfold, knowing that this was only the beginning of the horror that awaited me. After Adam arrived, the days blurred into a living hell I could never have imagined. He didn't just move in, he took over, assuming command of my life like it had always been his. What had once been my sanctuary became a battleground, and I was always on the losing side. He acted like a king in his castle, with Natalie by his side as his queen, and she reveled in my suffering. The woman I once loved had transformed into a stranger, her cruelty unrelenting, her orders issued with a flick of her hand, eyes cold and distant. I was no longer her husband. I was invisible, a ghost haunting the place I used to call home. Each day followed the same grim routine. I woke early to prepare their meals, cleaned the house, and catered to their every whim. They flaunted their affair openly, whispering to each other, exchanging touches, sharing private jokes while I stood there, helpless. Every stolen glance, every laugh was like a dagger to my heart, but I had no choice but to endure. The humiliation was unbearable, but as the days turned into weeks, something inside me shifted. Beneath the surface of despair, something darker began to grow. Hatred. Slowly, that seed of rage sprouted, fueling a desire for revenge. I couldn't let them destroy me, couldn't let them erase the man I used to be. The thought of revenge became my lifeline, the one thing that kept me going as I waited for the right moment to strike. At night, while they slept in the master bedroom that used to be mine, I lay awake in the guest room, my mind consumed by thoughts of payback. I knew I had to be patient, that every move had to be meticulously planned. One mistake, and Adam would kill me without hesitation. He was bigger, stronger, and always kept that gun close. But if I played my cards right, I could turn the tables and make them both pay. The opportunity finally came one evening, as we sat in the living room, tension hanging in the air like a thick fog. Adam, sipping whiskey, casually mentioned he had a business trip coming up. He'd be gone for a few days, leaving me alone with Natalie. A dark satisfaction crept through me at the thought of having her to myself, the perfect opening I had been praying for. In the days leading up to Adam's departure, I meticulously planned every detail. I spent hours researching poisons, reading articles and forums, learning how to administer them without raising suspicion. It was a dangerous path, but I was desperate enough to take the risk. I couldn't afford any mistakes. Everything had to go exactly as planned. The night arrived. Adam left for his trip, and silence fell over the house. It was just me and Natalie now, the tension between us unspoken. She had been drinking heavily, her steps unsteady as she leaned against the kitchen counter with a wine glass in hand. "Why don't you make us something special tonight?" she slurred, her lips curling into a lazy, drunken smile. "Of course," I replied, forcing a smile, though my heart raced in my chest. I couldn't let my nerves show. I moved through the kitchen calmly, pulling ingredients from the fridge, my hands steady as I began to prepare the meal. But tonight's dish would have a secret ingredient, one that would ensure Natalie wouldn't see another sunrise. Hidden in my apron was a vial of poison, lethal and undetectable. I added it to the sauce, carefully mixing it in, the aroma of the food masking the scent of death. When the meal was ready, I plated the food and brought it to the dining room. Natalie was already seated, her eyes glazed from the alcohol, a smug smirk on her lips. She didn't notice the slight tremble in my hand as I set the plate before her, nor the flicker of determination in my eyes. She was too absorbed in her own arrogance to sense the danger. I sat across from her, my heart pounding as she picked up her fork and took the first bite. Time seemed to slow, each second stretching into eternity as I waited for the poison to take hold. I watched her closely, searching for any sign that it was working. At first, nothing happened. She chewed and swallowed, took another bite. My chest tightened. Had I made a mistake? Was the dose too small? But then, slowly, her smirk faltered. Confusion clouded her eyes, followed by fear as she clutched her throat, gasping for breath. The poison was working. I stayed frozen, watching as Natalie's face twisted in terror. She tried to speak, to call out for help, but her voice was choked, her body convulsing as the poison took over. I felt no pity, no remorse for what I had done. She had turned me into a monster, and I had embraced it. Watching her suffer brought a grim satisfaction. She would never hurt me again. Her eyes widened in panic, her hands clawing at her throat as if she could pull the poison from her body. The transformation was swift and brutal. One moment she was the cruel, commanding woman who had tormented me. The next she was helpless, terrified, grasping for life. In her final moments, I saw something I hadn't seen in years: pure, unfiltered fear. The sight should have unsettled me. There should have been some flicker of humanity left inside, some buried instinct to feel guilt or pity. But I stood there, cold, empty, watching the poison race through her veins. This was the justice I had carefully planned for, the payback I had dreamed of. Everything that had consumed me for months, rage, shame, betrayal, had drained away, leaving behind nothing but a hollow, bitter satisfaction. The man who used to fear them, who used to cower, was gone. What stood in his place was something far darker. Natalie's legs buckled beneath her, and she crumpled onto the kitchen floor. Her body jerked, writhing violently as the poison tore through her, pulling her into a final, futile struggle for life. But she had already lost. Her mouth opened and closed, gasping for air that would never come. Her eyes, wide with terror, searched for mercy. I had none to offer. I watched as the light drained from those eyes, the ones that had once held affection for me, now dull and lifeless. It was surreal, like I was watching from a distance, detached from the moment, watching someone else's story unfold. The woman lying on the floor wasn't Natalie anymore. She was just a body, a hollow shell of the life we had built, the love that had once existed between us. Minutes passed, though it felt like hours. Her body finally stilled. The thrashing stopped. Her chest no longer rose and fell, and the silence that followed was thick, almost suffocating. It was the kind of silence that comes when something is over, something final. Natalie was gone, and I had made it happen. I stood there for a moment longer, staring at her lifeless form. Strangely, my mind was clear. The weight of what I'd done was starting to sink in, but instead of guilt or fear, there was only calm. I had crossed a line that I could never step back from, but I didn't care. The woman who had betrayed me, who had turned my life into a living hell, was gone, and soon Adam would follow. Without another glance at her, I turned and walked out of the kitchen. There was nothing more to be done. No final words, no sorrow, no regret. She had made her choices, and now she had paid the price for them. In the living room, I poured myself a drink. My hands shook slightly as I held the glass to my lips. The whiskey burned as it went down, warming my chest, steadying me. I needed to keep my mind sharp now. Adam would be back soon, and I had to be ready. I sank into the armchair, the leather creaking beneath me. The house was too quiet, as if it, too, knew something irreversible had happened. It was the kind of silence that comes after a breaking point, the kind that signals the end of one thing and the beginning of something else. I let the quiet settle around me, allowed myself to think about everything that had led to this. I thought about the man I used to be, the one who had loved Natalie, who had trusted her, who had believed they had a future. That man was dead, long gone, replaced by someone colder, harder, someone who had done what was necessary. There would be consequences for what I had done. I knew that. But as Natalie's body cooled in the next room, and the taste of whiskey lingered on my tongue, I felt nothing but grim satisfaction. The first part of my plan was done. She was dead, and Adam was next. I took another slow sip of whiskey, letting it dull the edges of my thoughts. There was still work to be done, one final act to finish before this nightmare ended. But for now, I allowed myself a moment to breathe, to savor the victory. The silence stretched on, the ticking of the clock the only sound breaking through. It was a reminder that time was passing, counting down to Adam's return. And when he came back, I'd be ready. Natalie's final breath had been taken, but the final scene was still to come. The days that followed her death were filled with tension. I had to move quickly, carefully. There was no room for error. My first job was to get rid of her body. It wasn't a task I took lightly, but I knew it had to be done. I wrapped her in heavy plastic, the kind used for construction, and dragged her body to the garage. Outside, the world seemed to hold its breath, the night unnaturally still, as if it was watching. I knew a spot, remote, secluded, far from any prying eyes. A place where the earth was soft, and the trees were thick enough to hide anything I left behind. I drove there under the cover of darkness, the weight of what I was doing pressing down on me with every mile. Digging her grave was exhausting, each shovelful of dirt a brutal reminder of the finality of my actions. By the time the grave was dug and filled, the first light of dawn was beginning to break. I covered the site carefully, hiding every trace, then drove home in silence, my mind numb to the enormity of what had just happened. Back at the house, I set to work erasing any trace of Natalie. Her clothes, her belongings, everything was packed away, as though she had simply disappeared, leaving no clue behind. I scrubbed every surface, cleaned every corner. There would be no sign of what had happened here. By the time I was finished, it was as if Natalie had never existed at all. When Adam came back, he was as oblivious as ever. The tension in the house clung like fog, thick and heavy, but he didn't notice. He walked in with that same arrogant swagger, filling the space like he owned it. I greeted him with the usual forced politeness, wearing the mask I had perfected over the last few weeks. Obedient, subservient. "Where's Natalie?" he asked, tossing his bags onto the floor like they didn't matter. "She said she needed some time away," I replied smoothly, not a flicker of truth in my voice. "Visiting a friend out of state." His eyes narrowed, suspicion creeping into his expression. He stared at me, searching for something, but after a moment, he shrugged. "She'll be back," he muttered, more to himself than me, as he wandered into the living room. "Yes," I thought, "but you won't." For the next few days, I played my part to perfection, head down, silent, catering to Adam's every demand, waiting for the right moment to strike. I knew he was on edge, suspicious after Natalie's sudden disappearance. I had to make him feel in control, like nothing had changed. It was all part of the plan. Every order he barked, every insult he threw my way, tested my patience. The anger simmered inside me, always threatening to rise, but I kept it buried. I reminded myself that the end was near. Just a little longer, and it would all be over. The moment came one evening. He was sitting in the living room, whiskey in hand, his attention fixed on the TV. I stood in the doorway, watching him, feeling the cold weight of the vial in my pocket. It was time. "Adam," I called, keeping my voice steady. He turned, irritation flickering across his face at the interruption. "What?" "I wanted to thank you," I said, stepping into the room, keeping my movements slow, deliberate. "For everything. For showing me who I really am." His brow furrowed, confusion darkening his features. He glanced at me, then back to his drink. "What the hell are you talking about?" I moved closer, hand slipping into my pocket, fingers wrapping around the vial. The glass was cool against my skin, solid, reassuring. "You've taught me a lot these past few weeks," I continued, my voice growing quieter, more deliberate. "About control, about power, and now, it's time for me to take it back." Before he could react, I stepped forward and emptied the vial into his whiskey. The liquid swirled for a moment, then stilled, the poison invisible. Adam's eyes widened in disbelief as he processed what had just happened. He opened his mouth to scream, to curse, but it was too late. "You son of a," he began, but the words stuck in his throat. His body tensed, muscles locking up as the poison started its brutal work. The glass slipped from his hand, shattering on the floor as he collapsed to his knees. The terror that had twisted Natalie's face in her final moments now crossed his wide, panicked eyes, his mouth hanging open, grasping for breath. He tried to crawl toward me, clawing at the carpet with trembling fingers, but his strength was fading fast. I stood still, watching him, my face emotionless. His body collapsed fully onto the floor, twitching, the last vestiges of life slipping from him. He looked up at me one last time, hatred burning in his gaze. "You bastard," he rasped, barely able to get the words out. Then silence. The house fell still, the ticking of the clock the only sound left. I stared down at Adam's lifeless body, the weight of what I'd done settling in slowly. Both of them, Natalie and Adam, gone. No more games, no more fear. Just the cold, final truth of what came next. I stood over him, staring at the corpse that had once been so smug and powerful. The silence pressed down on me, thick and oppressive. I knew I couldn't stay still. The clock was ticking, and every second wasted brought me closer to discovery. There was no room for error now. The body. I had to deal with the body. Adam was heavy, much heavier than I'd expected. Dragging him was harder than it had been with Natalie, but I pushed through, focusing on the task. His body scraped across the floor as I pulled him toward the garage, the sound harsh and grating in the stillness of the night. In the garage, I wrapped him in plastic sheeting, just like I had with Natalie. The thick material crinkled under my hands as I secured it tightly around his lifeless form. There was no time for hesitation, no room for doubt. This was just a task, a grim necessity. I loaded his body into the trunk of my car, moving mechanically, detached from the reality of what I was doing. The night outside was dark, clouds covering the stars, casting the world into a thick, oppressive gloom. The air was cold, heavy. I drove to the same secluded spot where Natalie lay buried, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. The road was deserted. The world was asleep, blissfully unaware of the dark act playing out in its midst. When I arrived, I didn't waste time. I grabbed the shovel I'd brought and started digging. The earth was cold, unyielding, and with every shovelful of dirt, the gravity of what I'd done pressed down harder. I kept digging, pushing myself further, deeper, until the hole was wide enough, deep enough. I lowered Adam's body into the ground, the finality of it echoing in my mind. The sound of the dirt falling over him was muffled, strangely hollow. With each layer, the weight of what I'd done became heavier, more real. When the grave was finally filled, I stood there for a moment, catching my breath, my body aching from the effort. The forest was silent, almost too silent, as if the world was watching me, holding its breath. With the body buried and the site hidden beneath layers of earth, I returned home. There was still work to be done. Every corner of the house had to be wiped clean, every trace of what had happened erased, as if Natalie and Adam had never existed. I moved through the rooms with grim determination, scrubbing, disinfecting, disposing of anything that could link me to their deaths. In the kitchen, where Natalie had taken her final ragged breath, I scrubbed the floor until my hands ached, the smell of bleach thick in the air. In the living room, where Adam had collapsed, I cleaned meticulously, every last remnant of their lives vanishing under my hands. It felt endless, the wiping, the scrubbing, but I pushed through, methodical, detached. When it was all done, the house looked perfect, immaculate, like nothing had ever happened. But as I stood in the center of the living room, staring at the spotless emptiness, I felt nothing. No sense of victory, no relief, just an aching hollowness. The house didn't feel like home anymore. It wasn't even familiar. It was a shell, just like me, filled with memories I didn't want to hold on to. The walls seemed to close in on me, pressing down with the weight of all that had happened. The silence that once brought comfort now felt unbearable, heavy with what I had done. I knew then I couldn't stay. This place, with its history of betrayal and violence, could never be a part of my future. I had to leave, to escape the ghosts that lingered here, whispering in the walls. I packed quickly, gathering only the essentials: clothes, money, a few personal items. The rest didn't matter anymore. I closed the door behind me, not looking back, as if shutting it could lock away the past forever. As I drove away, the sun was dipping toward the horizon, casting long golden shadows across the landscape. The road stretched out before me, open and uncertain, leading into the unknown. For the first time in a long time, I felt a sense of release. I was free, free from the fear, the anger, the humiliation that had chained me for so long. There was nothing behind me now but ashes. I kept driving, the night swallowing the road ahead, a strange peace settling over me. The past was dead. What came next was mine to decide.
See you later.